When was the last time a car made you look twice without even moving? Imagine this, the 1970s, a time when cars didn't try to be subtle. They were long, low, exaggerated, designed to be seen. And there was one type of car that took all of that to the extreme. Convertibles, cars with no roof, no limits, and where everything revolved around one thing, presence. So in this video, you're going to discover the most beautiful American convertibles of the 1970s. And I'll tell you something. Some of these cars weren't just beautiful, they were impossible to ignore. 1971, Cadillac Eldorado. Imagine a random afternoon in 1971. The sun going down, a long open road, and a car that didn't need to do anything to get attention. The Eldorado wasn't just big, it was dominant, long, low, with that wide front end and a grille that looked like it was designed to command respect. It wasn't a car trying to be elegant in a subtle way. It was luxury in its most obvious form. And that wasn't accidental, because in the early 70s, Cadillac didn't compete. Cadillac set the standard. Owning one of these wasn't just about having a car, it was about making a statement. And the Eldorado made that clear from the very first glance. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because this wasn't just any convertible. It was front-wheel drive, something extremely rare in American cars of this size at the time. That completely changed the car's architecture, the interior space, the way it felt to drive. It wasn't just big, it was different. And under the hood, the massive 8.2-liter V8, one of the largest engines ever installed in a production car. Official figures were around 365 horsepower, but beyond the number, what mattered was the feeling. This car didn't accelerate, it moved with authority, effortlessly, without urgency, as if nothing could stop it. And that fit perfectly with its purpose, because this wasn't a car made to go fast, it was a car made to be seen, to cruise through the city, to enjoy the moment, to make every drive feel more important than it really was. And there's a detail that makes it even more special. At that time, the American market was starting to change. New regulations, new priorities, and little by little, cars like this were starting to disappear. But in 1971, they were still at their peak, and the Eldorado was exactly that. Excess, right before the shift. When you look at its value today, it reflects that. A 1971 Cadillac Eldorado Convertible in good condition typically ranges between $20,000 and $50,000, with well-preserved examples reaching even higher figures. 1970 Buick Electra. It wasn't the most famous car, but when it showed up, you noticed, because the Electra didn't try to impress like Cadillac or grab attention in an exaggerated way. Its approach was different, cleaner, more balanced, more elegant. And that's what made it special. In a time when many cars leaned into excess, Buick played a different game. Long proportions, yes, but better resolved, less aggressive, more fluid, with a calmer design language. It was the kind of car that didn't need to shout to stand out, and that fit perfectly with its place in the market. Because Buick occupied a very specific position in the American landscape. It wasn't the ultimate luxury of Cadillac, but it also wasn't just a regular car. It was that perfect middle ground. A car for someone who wanted refinement, without going over the top. And the Electra represented that better than almost anything else. The interior followed that same philosophy. Spacious, comfortable, but with a level of detail that felt more refined than most people expected. It wasn't flashy, but it was very well done. And you could feel that in real use. This was a car made to cover long distances, without losing that sense of control and balance. Under the hood, the massive 455 V8, less dramatic in concept than the Cadillac, but just as serious. Plenty of power to move all that size effortlessly, with a response that felt solid, consistent, very Buick. This wasn't a car trying to impress with numbers. It was a car that made you feel comfortable in any situation. And that's where the contrast lies. Because even though it seemed more discreet, it wasn't any less of a car. It was just different. There's an interesting detail many people overlook. While Cadillac focused on immediate impact, Buick built cars that age better visually, less exaggerated, more harmonious, easier to appreciate over time. And this Electra is a perfect example of that. When you look at its value today, you see that reflected as well. A 1970 Buick Electra convertible in good condition typically ranges between $18,000 and $40,000, with well-preserved examples going even higher. 1970 Ford Mustang. It wasn't the biggest, it wasn't the most luxurious, but it was probably the most recognizable, because by 1970, the Mustang didn't need an introduction. It was an icon, a car that practically defined what it meant to have something sporty, yet accessible, and in convertible form. Everything changed, because now it wasn't just about being fast or attractive. It became a full experience. Top down, long flowing lines, that endless hood stretching out in front, and a sense of freedom that very few cars could deliver. But what makes the Mustang interesting in this context is that it wasn't playing the same game as the others. While Cadillac, Buick, or Oldsmobile focused on size and luxury, Ford focused on character, on attitude, on something much more emotional, and you could see it in the design, more aggressive, more defined, with a presence that didn't come from size, but from intention. The Mustang didn't dominate the road because it was huge. It dominated because of its personality, and that made it different. There were multiple configurations, from more modest engines to much more serious options. The 351 Cleveland, for example, pushed the car into another level, with a livelier, sharper response, much closer to what people expected from a Mustang. It wasn't the most refined, nor the most comfortable, but it was probably the most fun in this part of the list. And that's where the contrast is, because this car wasn't trying to be elegant, or sophisticated, or imposing. It was trying to be exciting, and it succeeded. There's a key detail here. The Mustang represented something many others couldn't: accessibility. It wasn't out of reach. It was something more people could actually own, and that made it part of the culture. It wasn't just a beautiful car. It was a car people lived with. When you look at its value today, that still shows. A 1970 Ford Mustang Convertible typically ranges between $25,000 and $60,000, depending on engine, condition, and originality, with rarer versions reaching even higher figures. And now, I'm curious. If you had to choose one for a weekend drive, would you go for the imposing luxury of the Cadillac, or something lighter and more emotional like this Mustang? I want to see what kind of experience you'd choose. 1970 Oldsmobile Delta. 88. This car wasn't trying to impress, but when you saw it, something just worked, because the Delta 88 wasn't the most aggressive, nor the most luxurious, nor the most attention-grabbing car of its time, but it had something many others didn't: balance, the proportions, the way the car sat on the road, the relationship between size and design. Everything felt more harmonious, more natural. There was no excess, but nothing was missing either, and that made it incredibly appealing. In the 1970s, Oldsmobile occupied a very interesting position in the market. It offered cars that combined comfort, presence, and a touch of performance, without going to extremes. And the Delta is exactly that. A car that doesn't need to exaggerate to feel complete. The design proves it: clean lines, wide surfaces, a solid front end, and a silhouette that flows without interruption. Nothing feels forced. Everything feels built to last, and that's something you appreciate even more today, because this kind of design doesn't exist anymore. Inside, the story continues. Generous space, comfortable seating, a sense of a car made to cover long distances effortlessly, but without completely isolating you from the drive. It was a car made to travel, but also to enjoy the journey. Under the hood, the available 455 V8 took things to another level. It didn't change the car's personality, but it added another layer of confidence, capability, and presence. This wasn't a nervous car. It was a solid one, the kind that always feels like it has something in reserve. And that's the point. Because the Delta 88 doesn't stand out for just one thing. It stands out for how everything comes together. There's an interesting detail here. Oldsmobile was one of the brands that best understood how to build complete cars in that era, without pushing them to extremes. And that's why many of their models have aged better than more dramatic competitors. This is one of them. When you look at its value today, You can see that reflected. A 1970 Oldsmobile Delta, 88, convertible in good condition, typically ranges between $18,000 and $35,000, with well-preserved examples going even higher. 1970, Chevrolet Chevelle SS. This car didn't just want attention, it demanded it from the very first second, because unlike the others, there's no subtlety here. This car blends two worlds that don't usually belong together, muscle car and open sky, and that changes everything. The lines are still aggressive, the front end more defined, the stance lower. Everything about it communicates intent. It's not trying to be purely elegant, it's trying to make an impact. But the moment you remove the roof, that aggression transforms. It's no longer just a car built to go fast. It becomes a car meant to be seen, and that creates something very special. Because very few cars manage to keep that strong character, while still delivering the sense of freedom that only a convertible can give. And the Chevelle does it. In 1970, Chevrolet was at one of its absolute peaks in performance, and the Chevelle SS was one of its strongest statements. It wasn't just good-looking, it was serious, very serious, especially when you step into the more powerful configurations. The 454 LS5 and even the LS6 in its most extreme versions pushed the car into an entirely different league. Numbers that were no longer just respectable, they were intimidating. And in a convertible, that made it even more special, because this wasn't a balanced car. It was an emotional one, the kind that makes you feel every acceleration, every sound, every moment, and that's the contrast. Because while many convertibles on this list are built for relaxation, this one could do that too, but it wasn't its only personality. There's an interesting detail here. The Chevelle SS convertible wasn't produced in large numbers, especially in the higher performance versions, and that makes it far more exclusive today than it might seem at first glance. When you look at its value now, that becomes very clear. Today, a well-preserved example can easily exceed $70,000, and rarer or better-equipped versions can go well beyond $100,000. This isn't just a beautiful car, it's a car with presence, because it doesn't try to balance anything. It tries to make you feel something. And it does. Instantly. 1970 Pontiac GTO. This car wasn't trying to be elegant. And that's exactly its charm. Because in a video full of luxury, long proportions, and refined presence, the GTO arrives with a completely different energy. Raw, direct, alive. From the first glance, it feels different. Tighter lines, a more aggressive stance, an attitude that doesn't try to please, it tries to dominate. And that changes the entire rhythm, because Pontiac, at that time, had a very clear identity. While other brands focused on comfort or sophistication, they wanted something more emotional, more visceral. And the GTO convertible is exactly that. A muscle car that, instead of softening when the roof is removed, becomes even more interesting. Because here, you don't lose character, you expose it. The wind, the sound, the driving sensation, everything becomes more intense. It's not just a car you look at, it's a car you feel, and that sets it apart from everything else. Under the hood, options like the 400 V8 Ram Air pushed it into another level. It wasn't just about power, it was about response. Immediate, alive, deeply connected to the driver. This wasn't a car that wanted to glide down the road. It wanted to interact with it, and you feel that in every detail. But here comes the contrast, because despite all that attitude, it's still a 1970s convertible. It still has presence, still carries that size, still belongs to that world where driving was also a visual experience, just with more character. There's an important detail here. The GTO convertible was never produced in large numbers compared to other versions, and that makes it more special today. It's not the typical muscle car you see everywhere. It's something more selective. And when you look at its current value, that becomes clear. A 1970 Pontiac GTO convertible typically ranges between $50,000 and $90,000, with well-restored examples going even higher. It's not the most refined, it's not the most luxurious, but it's probably one of the ones that makes you feel the most. 1970 Mercury Marquis. This car didn't chase attention, but when you saw it, it had it, because the Marquis wasn't playing the same game as Cadillac or Pontiac or Chevrolet. Its approach was quieter, more reserved, but just as solid. It was the kind of car that didn't need to exaggerate, because it already had everything it needed. The proportions say it all. Long, very long, with a silhouette that seems to stretch further than it should. The wide front end, the well-placed chrome details, and a presence that doesn't come from aggression, but from calm confidence. And that's what makes it different. Because this isn't a car that tries to impress instantly. It's a car you grow to appreciate. Back then, Mercury occupied a very interesting space in the market, right between Ford and Lincoln, offering something more refined than the ordinary, but without going all the way into full luxury. And the Marquis Convertible is exactly that. A car that blends size, comfort, and a more restrained elegance, more mature. Inside, everything follows that same idea. Generous space, well-finished materials, a feeling of a car designed to be enjoyed without needing to prove anything. It's not flashy, but it's complete, and you can feel that. Under the hood, engines like the 429 V8 gave it the mechanical presence needed to move all that mass effortlessly. It wasn't trying to surprise, but it was never lacking either. Everything about it was tuned to work together, and that made it incredibly consistent. And that's where the contrast lies. In a world where many cars were trying to stand out, this one chose not to, and still, it did. There's an interesting detail here. Many of these models lived in the shadow of more flashy brands, but over time, that subtlety became part of their appeal. Today they feel more exclusive, precisely because they weren't the obvious choice back then. When you look at its value today, that's reflected as well. A 1970 Mercury Marquis Convertible typically ranges between $15,000 and $35,000, depending on condition and originality. 1970 Dodge Challenger. This car didn't need an explanation, because from the very first second, it already said everything. Low, wide, with a stance that looked ready even when standing still. The Challenger Convertible doesn't try to be elegant, or subtle, or balanced. It tries to be impactful, and it succeeds. Because in this entire list, this is probably the car with the strongest immediate visual presence. That long hood, the aggressive grille, the tight, muscular lines. Everything is designed to grab attention. There's no subtlety here, and that's exactly the point. But once you remove the roof, everything changes, because that aggression blends with something completely different. It's no longer just a muscle car, it's a muscle car exposed. No barriers, no filters, no roof to soften the experience. Everything becomes more direct, more raw, more real, and that makes it even more special, because very few cars can keep such a strong character, while still delivering the freedom that defines a convertible. And the Challenger does it effortlessly. In 1970, Dodge was at one of its peaks in both design and performance, and the Challenger was one of its key statements. It wasn't just powerful, it was desirable, very desirable, especially in convertible form. Because here's where an important detail comes in. Production numbers were extremely low, very few were built, and that makes it far more exclusive than it might seem at first glance. This isn't just a beautiful car, it's a rare one, and that completely changes its value today. A 1970 Dodge Challenger Convertible can easily exceed $150,000, and rarer or well-documented examples can go far beyond that. 1975 Cadillac Eldorado. This wasn't just another car, it was the ending, because in 1975, Cadillac introduced this Eldorado with a very clear idea. It would be the last mass-produced American convertible, and that changed everything. It was no longer just a beautiful car, no longer just luxury, no longer just presence. It was a farewell. From the very first glance, it feels different, still big, still imposing, but now there's something more, a symbolic weight. The lines are heavier, more solid, less fluid than in earlier years, but not because of a lack of design, because of context, because this car no longer belongs to the same world as the early 70s. It belongs to a moment when everything was coming to an end. And even then, Cadillac did what it always did best. it finished strong. The 1975 Eldorado Convertible keeps everything that made the brand special: exaggerated size, absolute comfort, and a presence that doesn't rely on trends. This car doesn't try to adapt, it stays true to what it is, and that makes it even more powerful. Under the hood, the massive 500 V8 was still there, although slightly toned down by regulations. But once again, that's not the point. Because this car isn't measured by numbers, it's measured by what it represents. And that's where the final contrast of the video comes in. Because while all the other cars we've seen stand out for design, character, or style, this one stands out for its history, for being the last of an era when American convertibles dominated the road. And that doesn't happen twice. There's a detail that makes it even more interesting. Many of these cars were bought as collector cars from day one, because people already understood what they meant. And that's why so many of them have survived in excellent condition today. When you look at their current value, that becomes clear. A 1975 Cadillac Eldorado Convertible typically ranges between $25,000 and $60,000, with exceptional examples reaching even higher figures. And in the end, it's not just about which one is the most beautiful, because after seeing all these cars, you realize something different. Each one represents a different way of understanding what a car should be in that era. Some focused on absolute luxury, others on presence, others on emotion, and some simply on leaving one last mark before disappearing. And now I'm curious, out of everything you've seen in this video, which one truly stands out as the most beautiful car of the 1970s? Not the most expensive, not the rarest, the one that really made you stop and think, this is something else. I'll be reading your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy this kind of car, cars that don't just look good, but make you feel something, you need to watch this next video about the most elegant convertibles of the 1960s. Because if these represented excess, those show where it all began. And when you see them, you'll understand why that era was so special. See you in the next video.